When my apartment burned down, I called my parents for help. My mother simply laughed over the sound of clinking champagne glasses and told me it was not their problem. She said I should have been more careful. But then the fire investigator pulled me away from the flashing red lights of the fire trucks. He asked if I knew who had access to my apartment last week because his team found something at the ignition point. What he dropped into my trembling hands made my blood run absolutely cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Gia, and I am 32 years old. I stood on the freezing pavement, wrapped in a thin foil blanket, handed to me by a paramedic. The night air bit into my skin, but I could barely feel the cold. All I could feel was the intense, blistering heat radiating from the third floor of my apartment complex. Bright orange flames licked the night sky, shattering the glass of what used to be my living room window. Black smoke billowed into the atmosphere, carrying away everything I owned. I am an independent art appraiser. I spent the last 10 years building my reputation from the ground up without a single dime from my family. My apartment was not just my home, it was my sanctuary and my workspace. It held my research, my authenticated certificates and pieces I had carefully collected over a decade. Now it was just a glowing inferno. Sirens wailed around me as firefighters shouted orders, pulling heavy hoses across the wet asphalt. My hands shook violently as I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. It was the only thing I managed to grab when the fire alarms jolted me awake at 2 a.m. My first instinct, the ingrained childhood reflex I had spent years trying to unlearn, was to call my mother. Brenda was the esteemed First Lady of the largest Black megachurch in Atlanta. To the congregation, she was a beacon of grace and charity. Behind closed doors, she was a woman who measured human worth strictly by tax brackets and social standing. I dialed her number, praying that just this once, the mother in her would override the First Lady persona. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. Loud jazz music and the unmistakable roar of a lively celebration blasted through the speaker. "Mom," I gasped, coughing as my lungs rejected the lingering taste of ash. "Mom, my building is on fire. I lost everything. I am standing out on the street and I do not know what to do. Can I please come stay at the house tonight?" The music on her end did not lower. "Gia," she said, her voice dripping with irritation rather than panic. "Why are you calling me with this drama right now? Preston just closed a massive commercial real estate deal. We are celebrating his promotion at the country club." I clutched the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Mom, please," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "I have no clothes. My entire life is burning right in front of me. I just need a place to sleep." A sharp sigh echoed through the receiver. "I told you living in that cheap neighborhood would catch up to you," she snapped. "You insisted on playing the starving artist appraising dusty old junk instead of getting a real corporate job like your sister. Erica married a wealth manager. She secured her future. You chose to live in a tinderbox. That is not our problem, Gia. You should have been more careful. Call a shelter. Do not ruin this night for us." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a swarm of angry hornets. She did not even ask if I was hurt. She did not care that I had narrowly escaped being burned alive. All that mattered was protecting the flawless image of her golden child, Erica, and her beloved white son-in-law, Preston. Erica always got exactly what she wanted. Growing up, she was the flawless pageant queen, the perfect church daughter who never stepped out of line. I was the one constantly told to fix my natural hair tone, down my opinions, and stop asking so many questions. When she brought Preston home, my parents treated him like a savior who had descended from heaven to elevate our family status. They completely ignored his condescending remarks and the way he constantly talked down to me. Preston was a smug, arrogant wealth manager who paraded his privilege around our family while my parents treated him like royalty. He brought in high-value donors for my father Calvin, who was the charismatic pastor of our megachurch. To Calvin and Brenda Preston was the ultimate trophy, a symbol that our family had truly arrived. I was just the scapegoat, the dark-skinned daughter who refused to conform to their rigid, suffocating standards of excellence. I stood there shivering violently as the realization washed over me. I was entirely alone. I wrapped the foil blanket tighter around my shoulders, staring blankly at the collapsing roof of my building. A tall man in a heavy dark jacket approached me. His badge identified him as Investigator Cole. His face was smeared with soot, and his expression was deadly serious. "Miss Washington," he asked, stepping into my line of sight and blocking the blinding strobe of the police lights. I nodded, unable to force any words past the lump in my throat. He motioned for me to follow him away from the chaotic crowd of displaced residents and busy emergency responders. We walked toward the back of his incident command vehicle where the noise was slightly muffled. "I am the lead fire investigator for this district," Cole stated, his voice low and raspy. "I need to ask you some very specific questions about your residents." I swallowed hard, tasting the bitter ash. "Was it an electrical fault?" I asked. "The wiring in that building is decades old. I told the landlord last month that the breakers kept tripping." Cole shook his head slowly. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach drop. "No, Miss Washington. This was not an electrical failure. This was not a gas leak. And this was not an accident." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. "Not an accident." He leaned against the side of his vehicle and pulled out a small notepad. "The fire originated in your specific unit," he explained. "Third floor apartment 3B. The burn patterns show multiple points of origin in your living room and your home office. Someone poured a highly flammable accelerant across your floors and deliberately ignited it. The fire spread rapidly because they knew exactly where to place the accelerant to cause maximum structural damage." My knees suddenly felt weak. Someone deliberately set my apartment on fire. Someone tried to kill me. I was asleep in the bedroom. I stammered, my chest tightening with panic. "If the smoke detector had not gone off when it did, I would have been trapped." Cole nodded grimly. "That is why I need to know who has access to your apartment, who has a key, who has been inside your home in the last 2 weeks. Do you have any disgruntled clients? Any ex-boyfriends with a grudge? Anyone who would want to see your life go up in flames?" I shook my head frantically. "Nobody," I insisted. "I live alone. I appraise art. I do not have enemies. The only people who have my spare key are the building superintendent and the cleaning service. I do not understand why anyone would target me." Cole reached into his heavy jacket pocket. "Well, someone did," he said firmly, "and they were careless. Arsonists usually think the fire will destroy all the evidence. But fires are unpredictable. They burn hot and fast upward, but they leave cold spots near the floorboards. We found something near the primary ignition point in your office. It was shielded by a collapsed metal filing cabinet, which prevented it from completely melting." He pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag and held it up under the harsh glare of the street lamp. Inside the bag was a heavy piece of metal, half blackened by soot and partially warped by the extreme heat. But the top half was still gleaming, catching the light. It was a platinum money clip. I stared at the object, my breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Look closely," Miss Washington, Cole instructed, shining his flashlight directly onto the bag. "Do you recognize this item? Have you ever seen it before?" I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing as I focused on the intricate engraving on the surviving half of the platinum surface. The crest was unmistakable: 2 crossed golf clubs beneath a sprawling oak tree with bold italic lettering curving around the bottom edge. "Elite Heritage Country Club." My blood turned to absolute ice. The Elite Heritage Country Club was an exclusive, notoriously elitist golf club located in the wealthiest suburb of the city. It was the kind of place where memberships were passed down through generations and outsiders were rarely welcomed. My father, Pastor Calvin, had spent 5 years lobbying, networking, and making massive charitable donations just to secure a trial membership. He was obsessed with the prestige it brought him. Last Christmas, my father hosted a lavish dinner at his mansion to celebrate his official acceptance into the club. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, raising a glass of expensive scotch to make a grand speech about generational wealth. Then he pulled out a small velvet box and handed it to Preston. Inside was a custom-made platinum money clip engraved with the club crest and Preston initials on the back. Calvin had proudly announced that he bought it to thank Preston for managing the church investment portfolio. I remember watching Preston eagerly accept the gift, flashing his signature arrogant smirk as he clipped it onto a thick wad of cash right at the dinner table. Erica had clapped her hands, gushing about how her husband was the most successful man in the room, while I sat silently at the end of the table eating my dinner. I blinked, tearing my eyes away from the evidence bag and looking up at Investigator Cole. The cold night air suddenly felt suffocating. I knew exactly who that money clip belonged to. But the implications were too massive, too dangerous to voice out loud, without absolute certainty. If Preston was in my apartment pouring gasoline on my floors, it meant he was not just an arrogant brother-in-law. It meant he was a ruthless criminal willing to commit murder. The sheer audacity of his crime made my stomach twist into painful knots. This was a man who sat in the front pew every Sunday pretending to be a pillar of morality. He wore custom-tailored suits and drove a luxury imported car that cost more than my entire apartment building. Yet here he was, creeping around in the dark, like a common thief willing to destroy my entire life just to line his own overflowing pockets. Why would a wealthy, successful portfolio manager break into a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood to commit arson? The answer hit me with the force of a freight train. The painting. Last month I had been called to appraise the contents of an abandoned storage unit. Hidden beneath layers of moldy canvas and discarded furniture, I found something extraordinary. It was an original, undocumented masterpiece by a legendary Harlem Renaissance painter from the 1920s. After weeks of careful research and chemical testing, I authenticated it. The market value was projected to be around $4.5 million. I had kept the discovery completely quiet, waiting for the right moment to announce it to the art world. But 2 weeks ago, Preston had casually cornered me at a family brunch, asking unusually specific questions about my business finances and my recent appraisals. He boasted about how he could audit anyone's financial footprint if he wanted to. He must have hacked into my business accounts, seen the appraisal documents, and realized I was sitting on a multi-million-dollar gold mine. He did not burn my apartment to kill me. He burned it to cover his tracks after stealing the masterpiece. I looked at Cole, my mind racing with a million calculations. If I told the investigator right now that my brother-in-law was the arsonist, my family would completely destroy me. Calvin would use his immense power in the community to paint me as a jealous, lying lunatic. Brenda would rally the church congregation to defend Preston's honor. Erica would hire an army of high-powered lawyers to crush me in court. They had already abandoned me at my lowest moment. They would not hesitate to bury me to protect their perfect image. I needed absolute, undeniable proof before I made my move. I needed to trap Preston in a corner he could not buy his way out of. "Do you know who this belongs to?" "Miss Washington?" Cole asked again, his voice breaking through my racing thoughts. I looked from the platinum money clip to the roaring flames still consuming my past life. I squared my shoulders, wrapping the foil blanket around myself like armor. "No, Investigator Cole." I lied, my voice remarkably steady. "I have never seen it before in my life. But if I think of anyone who might have dropped it, I will let you know." He nodded, clearly unconvinced, but willing to let it go for the moment. "We will be in touch," he said, tucking the evidence bag away. "Do not leave town." I walked away from the command vehicle, stepping into the shadows of the street. I had lost my home, my clothes, and my sanctuary. My mother had just told me my survival was not her problem. But Preston had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the scapegoat. He thought I was just a desperate girl with a failing art business who would cry in the ashes and fade away. He had no idea that I had installed a state-of-the-art hidden 4K security camera inside the smoke detector of my home office. A camera that fed directly to a secure encrypted cloud server. He thought he burned all the evidence. He had actually just handed me the match I was going to use to burn his entire empire to the ground. The drive to my parents' gated community took 40 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. I gripped the steering wheel of my rental car until my knuckles ached. The smell of wet ash and toxic chemical smoke was baked into my pores. It clung to the oversized sweatpants and faded t-shirt the Red Cross volunteer had handed me at the scene. I had not slept. I had not eaten. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the orange flames devouring my life, my career, my sanctuary. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the massive estate, purchased through the generous tithes of my father's loyal congregation. The security guard buzzed me through without a word, though his eyes lingered on my disheveled state. I parked behind Preston's pristine silver Porsche Panamera. Seeing that car sitting there gleaming in the afternoon sun made a fresh wave of nausea roll through my stomach. I stepped out of the car, my legs heavy and stiff. I walked up the sweeping brick driveway toward the double mahogany front doors. I did not bother to knock. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside was climate-controlled and smelled of expensive vanilla candles, roasted garlic, and rosemary. From the formal dining room down the hall, I could hear the booming baritone of my father Calvin holding court. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings. They were having their traditional Sunday dinner, a sacred weekly ritual of excess and self-congratulation. I walked down the marble hallway, my cheap rubber slides squeaking against the polished stone. As I turned the corner into the dining room, the laughter abruptly died. The scene before me was a perfect tableau of upper-class perfection. The long table was set with fine china and crystal goblets. My father sat at the head, looking regal in his tailored Sunday suit. My mother Brenda sat to his right, dripping in pearls and quiet judgment. Erica, my older sister, looked like she had just stepped off a magazine cover, wearing a silk emerald dress that hugged her perfectly toned figure. And there beside her sat Preston, swirling a glass of deep red wine, looking utterly relaxed. Erica was the first to speak. She lowered her fork, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in a mixture of disgust and amusement. "What on earth are you wearing, Gia?" she asked, her voice carrying that familiar mocking lilt. "You look like you have been digging through a dumpster. Did you seriously come to Sunday dinner smelling like a barbecue pit? We have guests coming over later for dessert. You cannot be seen looking like a homeless person." I did not answer her. I walked slowly toward the table, my eyes locked entirely on Preston. The confident, easygoing smile on his face did not waver as I approached. He took a slow sip of his wine, watching me with the amused detachment of a predator observing a trapped mouse. "My apartment burned down last night," I said, my voice hoarse from the smoke inhalation. "It is completely gone. Everything I own is ashes." My father Calvin frowned, setting his linen napkin on the table. "We know, Gia. Your mother told us you called in the middle of the night acting hysterical. I have told you time and time again that the neighborhood you chose to live in was a liability. It is full of crime and neglect. I offered to let you manage the church community center, but you insisted on pursuing this independent art business nonsense. Now look where your stubbornness has led you." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. "You are blaming me for my home burning down." Brenda sighed heavily, resting her hand on her chest. "Oh, stop playing the victim, Gia. Nobody is blaming you. We are simply pointing out the consequences of your choices. Preston just secured a multi-million-dollar commercial expansion for the church campus. We are trying to celebrate a monumental achievement for this family, and you burst in here looking for pity. The Lord tests us so we can learn to make better decisions." I reached into the deep pocket of my sweatpants. My fingers closed around the plastic evidence bag Investigator Cole had let me keep after I claimed it was a family heirloom. I pulled it out and stepped directly up to Preston. He did not flinch. He did not lean back. He just tilted his head slightly, waiting. I slammed the clear plastic bag directly onto his pristine white china plate, right in the middle of his roasted lamb. The heavy metal hit the porcelain with a loud, harsh crack that echoed through the silent dining room. "What was this doing at the origin point of my apartment fire, Preston?" I demanded, my voice rising, slicing through the heavy tension. Everyone at the table stared at the bag. The platinum money clip, half melted and charred black, lay perfectly still. The crest of the elite Heritage Country Club was clearly visible through the clear plastic. Erica let out a sharp gasp. "Preston, what is that?" I kept my eyes pinned on him. "Tell her, Preston," I challenged, leaning over the table. "Tell your wife why your custom-engraved platinum money clip, the exact one my father gave you for Christmas, was found buried under the ashes of my home office. Tell them why the fire investigator determined that the fire started exactly where this was dropped." For a fraction of a second, the room was completely paralyzed. I waited for the panic to set into Preston's eyes. I waited for the stammering, for the desperate excuses, for the sweat to break out on his forehead, but none of that happened. Instead, Preston slowly set down his wine glass. He looked at the burned metal, then looked up at me, his lips curled into a slow, chilling smirk. Before Preston could even open his mouth, my mother stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. She marched around the table, her eyes blazing with sudden, furious rage. I barely had time to turn my head before her hand connected with my cheek. The slap echoed through the room like a gunshot. The physical force of it snapped my head to the side, leaving a burning, stinging imprint across my skin. "How dare you?" Brenda screamed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "How dare you march into this house and accuse your brother-in-law of such a vile, disgusting thing?" I held my stinging cheek, staring at my mother in absolute shock. "Mom, the evidence is right there. It was in his pocket." "Shut your mouth," Brenda interrupted, pointing a trembling finger inches from my face. "Preston is managing the church expansion fund. He is handling millions of dollars for your father's legacy. He is a respected wealth manager. And you, what are you? You are a bitter, lonely woman who appraises dusty old junk in a rundown neighborhood. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of Erica and Preston." "Jealous?" I choked out, tasting copper in my mouth. "He burned my house down." "You are lying," Erica yelled, standing up to join our mother. "You are making this up because you cannot stand to see me happy. This is exactly like what you did at my baby shower." The baby shower. 2 years ago, I had discovered that the caterer Erica hired was overcharging her by thousands. When I quietly brought it to Erica's attention to save her money, Brenda had accused me of trying to sabotage the event because I was bitter about being single and childless. They had twisted my protection into jealousy then, and they were doing it again now. "You ruined my baby shower because you couldn't handle my success," Erica continued, her voice shrill and grating. "And now you are trying to ruin Preston's celebration. You probably stole that money clip from his coat the last time you were here, just so you could frame him. You are sick, Gia. You need psychiatric help. Look at the facts, Dad," I pleaded, turning to Calvin, who was still sitting calmly at the head of the table. "Please, look at the clip. Preston was in my apartment." Calvin folded his hands, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, the exact look he used from the pulpit when preaching about sinners who had lost their way. "Gia," he began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Preston is a pillar of this community. He has brought substantial white investors to our congregation, crossing racial barriers to elevate our church. Do you honestly expect me to believe that a man of his stature would drive to your neighborhood, break into your apartment, and set a fire? To achieve what exactly? What could you possibly possess that a man like Preston would want to destroy?" I opened my mouth to tell them about the painting. I wanted to scream about the $4 million masterpiece I had hidden the discovery Preston had found out about. But looking at my family united like a fortress around the smiling white man sitting at the table, I knew the truth would not save me. If I told them about the painting, they would not turn on Preston. They would help him sell it. They would claim it belonged to the family. They would silence me permanently to protect their wealth. I clamped my jaw shut, swallowing the secret whole. "See," Preston said, speaking for the first time. His voice was smooth, calm, and dripping with condescension. "She has nothing to say." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He casually extracted a crisp $100 bill. He did not hand it to me. He let it slip from his fingers, watching it flutter down until it landed on the floor by my cheap rubber slides. Go buy yourself some clean clothes, Gia, he said, his blue eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying emptiness. You must be deeply traumatized by losing your things, but your little conspiracy theory has a massive hole in it. I reported that exact money clip stolen to the police over a week ago. I have the filed report and the insurance claim to prove it. I stared at him, my blood running completely cold. He had planned this. He had planned this down to the very last detail. He knew the clip was missing, or he intentionally left it there to mock me, and he had built an ironclad alibi before he even poured the gasoline. Nice try trying to frame me, Preston continued, leaning back in his chair and picking up his wineglass again. But we all know what this really is. Your art appraisal business is failing. You are drowning in debt. You deliberately set fire to your own apartment to cash out your renter's insurance policy, and now you are trying to drag my name into the mud to deflect suspicion from yourself. That is a lie, I shouted, stepping forward, but Brenda shoved me back hard by my shoulders. Get out of my house, Brenda snarled, her face twisted in disgust. I will not have a criminal and a liar standing in my dining room trying to destroy my family. If you do not leave this instant, I will have security drag you out, and I will personally tell the police about your little insurance scam. I looked at my mother, the woman who had birthed me. I looked at Erica, who was glaring at me with triumphant hatred. I looked at my father, who had already turned back to his meal as if I no longer existed. They had made their choice. They had chosen the wealthy white son-in-law over their own flesh and blood. They had chosen the illusion of power and proximity to wealth over the truth. I bent down slowly and picked up the clear plastic evidence bag containing the burned money clip. I left the $100 bill sitting on the floor. You are all going to regret this, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet whisper. Every single one of you. Erica rolled her eyes. Just leave, Gia. You are embarrassing yourself. I turned around and began the long walk back down the marble hallway. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had no home. I had no family. I was completely isolated, fighting against a man who had the money and the influence to crush me without breaking a sweat. I pushed through the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped back out into the sweltering afternoon heat. As I walked down the driveway toward my rental car, I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with a new email notification. The sender was my insurance provider. I swiped the screen open, reading the bold text at the top of the message. Urgent notice regarding claim status. I skimmed the contents, my breath catching in my throat. We regret to inform you that your insurance payout has been indefinitely frozen, pending a formal fraud investigation. Our office received an anonymous tip this morning containing detailed allegations that the fire at your residence was intentionally set by the policyholder for financial gain. All funds are withheld until local authorities clear you of suspicion in this ongoing arson investigation. I stopped dead in my tracks, the phone trembling in my hand. He didn't just burn my apartment. He had actively moved to cut off my only lifeline. He had frozen my insurance money, ensuring I would be left completely destitute, unable to hire a lawyer, unable to secure new housing, unable to fight back. I turned around slowly, looking back toward the mansion. Through the large, formal dining room window, I could see the family laughing again. And there, sitting right in the center of them, was Preston. He was looking directly through the glass, right at me. As I stood there shivering in the heat, ruined and penniless, Preston raised his wineglass in a mock salute. Then, looking right into my eyes, he offered a slow, deliberate wink. That slow, deliberate wink from across the manicured lawn burned itself into my retinas. I stood frozen on the pristine sidewalk of my parents' gated community while the reality of my situation locked around my throat like a vice. Preston had not just burned my sanctuary to the ground. He had financially paralyzed me. I opened my banking app on my phone, my fingers still trembling from the adrenaline of my mother slapping me. My checking account showed a negative balance. My savings account was locked with a red fraud alert banner plastered across the screen. Preston worked as a wealth manager for the most elite financial institution in the city. He knew exactly which strings to pull and which anonymous tips to feed the fraud department to freeze my entire existence. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me crawling. I walked back to the cheap rental car the insurance company had provided just hours before they froze my claim. The smell of smoke on my clothes filled the small cabin as I locked the doors. I had $32 in my wallet. No home, no family, no access to my own money. I drove to a 24-hour supermarket parking lot on the edge of the city. I parked under a flickering street lamp, seeking the meager safety of its light. I reclined the driver's seat and pulled the thin foil emergency blanket over my chest. The night was bitterly cold. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flames eating through my living room walls. I heard the laughter of my sister Erica mocking my ruined clothes. I felt the sting of my mother Brenda striking my face to protect the white son-in-law who was systematically destroying my life. But I did not cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had a safety net. I had a war to win. The hours dragged on in absolute freezing misery. The vinyl seats of the rental car offered no comfort, and the thin foil blanket trapped the sharp metallic smell of my burning apartment against my skin. I watched the parking lot empty out until only a few scattered cars remained. My mind raced through every possible scenario, trying to find a weak point in Preston and his immaculate armor. He was protected by my father and his massive congregation. He was protected by his wealth and his corporate connections. I was an outsider in my own family, stripped of my resources and pushed to the absolute edge of society. The harsh rapping against my driver's side window jolted me awake just as the sun began to rise over the concrete horizon. I sat up, blinking against the harsh morning light. A heavy tow truck was backed up to the front bumper of my rental car. A thick steel chain was already hooked to the undercarriage, locking my vehicle in place. I scrambled out of the car, my muscles screaming in protest from sleeping in the cramped driver's seat. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice raspy and dry. The tow truck driver did not even look at me. He just pointed a greasy finger toward the black luxury sedan parked a few yards away. The tinted window of the sedan rolled down slowly. Preston was sitting in the driver's seat wearing a crisp, tailored navy suit and sipping from a pristine white coffee cup. He stepped out of his car and walked toward me, the gravel crunching under his expensive Italian leather shoes. "Good morning, Gia," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "You look terrible. You really should not be sleeping in parking lots. It is not safe for a woman alone." I crossed my arms, ignoring the biting morning wind that whipped through my oversized sweatpants. "Tell him to unhook my car, Preston. This is an insurance rental." Preston sighed, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Actually, your insurance company flagged this vehicle rental as part of their ongoing fraud investigation. They authorized the retrieval agency to repossess it immediately. I just happened to know the agency owner and thought I would come supervise to ensure you were not stranded." He reached into his perfectly tailored jacket and pulled out a long white envelope. He held it out to me, his blue eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "You are out of options, Gia. Your accounts are frozen. Your business is literal ashes. You are facing imminent federal arson charges. Calvin and Brenda are deeply embarrassed by your erratic behavior. You are tearing this family apart. But because I am a generous man, I am willing to give you a way out." I stared at the envelope but did not take it. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dead flat. "It is a one-way bus ticket to Chicago," Preston said smoothly, "and a cashier check for $1,000. It is enough to get you a cheap motel and some clean clothes. Take the money, Gia. Leave Atlanta today. Go away quietly so you do not embarrass the Pastor family any further. If you disappear right now, I will make sure the insurance investigators stop digging. Start over somewhere else and leave us alone." I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from his pores. He thought he had won. He thought he had stripped away every layer of my dignity and reduced me to a beggar. He genuinely believed that the black daughter who never fit into the country club mold would just take his pennies and run away in shame. I did not take the envelope. I looked him dead in the eye. You burned down my apartment for nothing, Preston. You really think a bus ticket is going to fix what you just started? Preston dropped his arm, his smile vanishing completely. His eyes turned cold and hard, reflecting the true monster hiding beneath the wealth manager facade. You are playing a dangerous game, Gia. You have absolutely nothing. You are a ghost. Take the ticket, or you will spend the next 20 years in a federal women prison for arson and insurance fraud. Have a nice trip. He dropped the envelope onto the wet pavement, turned around, and walked back to his luxury sedan. The tow truck driver hoisted my rental car into the air and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the empty parking lot with the exhaust fumes blowing in my face. I bent down slowly, picked up the envelope, and ripped the bus ticket and the cashier check into tiny pieces. I threw the confetti of thick paper into a nearby trash can. I slung my heavy canvas tote bag over my shoulder. It was the only item I had managed to grab before running out of my burning apartment. Preston thought I grabbed it to save my wallet or my personal identification. He was entirely wrong. I walked 2 miles down the highway until I reached a public library, just as the heavy glass doors were opening for the day. I went straight to the back corner, found a secluded study carrel away from the security cameras, and sat down. I opened my tote bag and pulled out my encrypted iPad. It was heavy, encased in a military-grade fireproof and waterproof shell. As an independent art appraiser, my digital records were my livelihood and my reputation. I pressed my thumb to the scanner and logged into my secure offline database. I pulled up a hidden folder named Harlem Gold. Preston had audited my business bank records illegally, using his wealth management credentials to pry into my financial footprint. He saw a massive pending transaction and realized I was sitting on a gold mine, but he did not understand exactly what he was looking at because he only saw the money. A month prior, I had been hired to appraise the contents of an abandoned storage unit belonging to a deceased estate. Behind a stack of rotting furniture, I found a canvas wrapped in heavy moving blankets. When I peeled back the layers, I found an original undocumented painting by a legendary 1920s Harlem Renaissance artist. The artist's works were considered national treasures, capturing the raw emotion and vibrant culture of Black history. I spent 3 grueling weeks conducting chemical analyses, pigment testing, and historical cross-referencing. I definitively authenticated the piece. It was a lost masterpiece. The estimated auction value was $4.5 million. I had kept the discovery absolutely silent. I knew the moment the art world found out, the media frenzy would be overwhelming, and I needed to ensure the legal provenance was ironclad. I stored the painting in my apartment for exactly 2 days, while I arranged for secure armored transport to a climate-controlled bank vault. During those 2 days, Preston had hacked my accounts and seen the temporary insurance binder I requested for the piece. Preston did not burn my apartment down to punish me for being the family outcast. He burned it down to cover up the fact that he stole a $4.5 million painting. He poured the gasoline to make sure the authorities believed the painting was destroyed in the blaze, along with all my appraisal equipment and physical records. It was the perfect crime. Steal a masterpiece, blame the victim for insurance fraud, and let the family dynamics protect the wealthy white son-in-law from any suspicion. He thought he was untouchable. I opened a specific application on my iPad, connecting to an offshore cloud server I paid for annually. Preston was a financial genius, but he was incredibly arrogant when it came to modern technology. He assumed my apartment was just a cheap rental with no security system. He assumed a woman struggling to build an independent business could not afford high-end surveillance. He did not realize that securing multi-million-dollar art requires serious paranoia and meticulous preparation. I had installed hidden 4K resolution cameras inside the smoke detectors in my living room and my home office. The cameras were hardwired into the walls and transmitted footage continuously to an external server. The fire destroyed the physical cameras, but the footage was already thousands of miles away, sitting safely in my encrypted cloud drive. I clicked on the video file timestamped at 1:15 in the morning on the night of the fire. The high-definition footage began to play on my screen. I watched the door of my apartment silently swing open. Preston stepped into the frame, wearing dark clothes and black leather gloves. The night vision capture illuminated his face perfectly. There was no ski mask. There was no attempt to hide his identity. He was so confident that the fire would erase him that he did not even bother to cover his face. I watched him walk straight into my home office, moving with deliberate purpose. I watched his expensive shoes step onto my hardwood floors. I saw him reach into his jacket and pull out a steel crowbar. He pried open my heavy wooden display cabinet, shivering the wood into splinters. He reached inside and pulled out the canvas wrapped carefully in protective plastic. I watched as he leaned over, dropping something small and metallic near the base of my desk. The custom platinum money clip from the Elite Heritage Country Club. He did not plant it there to frame himself. It simply slipped out of his pocket while he was struggling with the heavy canvas. I watched him carry the painting out of the frame. 2 minutes later, he returned carrying a large red plastic gasoline canister. His face was twisted in a concentrated grimace as he splashed the accelerant across my office floor, making sure to douse my desk, my filing cabinets, and the exact spot where the painting had been stored. I watched him strike a match. The screen flared violently white before the camera feed abruptly cut out, destroyed by the intense heat of the ignition. I sat in the dead silence of the public library staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my iPad. I had the smoking gun. I had the absolute undeniable proof that Preston committed first-degree arson, grand larceny, and attempted murder. All I had to do was walk into the local police precinct, hand over the iPad, and Preston would be arrested before dinner. But I did not stand up. I did not move toward the door. I stayed seated, gripping the edges of the tablet until my knuckles turned white. Going to the police right now would send Preston to jail, but it would not give me the justice I truly deserved. If I went to the police, my father Calvin would use his massive church slush fund to hire the best defense attorneys in the country. My mother Brenda would go on television and cry about how her successful son-in-law was being framed by a jealous, estranged daughter. Erica would parade her perfect life in front of the cameras, painting me as a bitter lunatic. They would drag the legal process out for years, torturing me in the press and destroying my professional reputation completely. They would make me the villain, and they would use their religious platform to do it. Besides, Preston was a wealth manager. Wealth managers do not steal art and commit arson unless they are desperate. If Preston was willing to risk federal prison to steal a $4.5 million painting, it meant he owed somebody a massive amount of money. He was drowning in a financial deficit that he could not cover with his normal income or his pristine reputation. He needed the painting to save his own life. He was going to try to sell it. He had no choice but to move the asset quickly. A slow, cold smile spread across my face, warming the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I was not going to the police. I was going to let Preston take that painting to market. I was going to let him stand in front of his wealthy elite investors and stake his entire reputation on the sale of that masterpiece. I was going to let him climb to the very top of his pedestal where my parents worshipped him. And then I was going to push him off. I closed my iPad and slid it back into my canvas tote bag. My family wanted to call me a failure. They wanted to strip me of everything and leave me with ashes. They were about to learn that ashes make the perfect foundation for a burial ground. 2 weeks passed since the fire, and my family thought I had vanished into the shadows of my own misery. They assumed I had taken their abuse and crawled into a hole to hide. They were busy preparing for the social event of the season, completely unaware that the ghost they created was walking right through their front doors. I needed a way inside the newly constructed community center of my father church. The building was a massive architectural marvel funded by the heavy tithes of working-class parishioners, but tonight it looked like an exclusive Wall Street gala. Preston and Erica had transformed the multi-purpose hall into a high-end auction house to sell their stolen prize. Black velvet curtains covered the walls, and temporary track lighting illuminated the space. I knew the catering company they used because I had appraised the owner private art collection 3 years ago. A quick phone call and a massive favor called in secured me a crisp white button-down shirt, a black vest, and a spot on the serving rotation. I stood in the sweltering heat of the commercial kitchen adjusting the tight collar of my uniform. The smell of roasted duck and expensive truffle oil hung heavy in the air. I grabbed a silver tray loaded with delicate crystal champagne flutes. My hands were steady. The panic that had consumed me in the ashes of my apartment was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculated focus. I pushed through the swinging double doors and stepped out into the main ballroom. The lighting was deliberately dim, directing all the attention toward the raised stage at the front of the room. On that stage, resting on an ornate wooden easel, was a painting covered by a heavy silk drape. My painting. The masterpiece Preston had burned my life to the ground to steal. I kept my head down, letting my dark hair fall forward to shadow my face. I moved silently through the crowd of wealthy investors, politicians, and elite church donors. I saw my father Calvin standing near the front row, shaking hands with a state senator. He wore a custom silk suit and a bright, charismatic smile, projecting the image of a humble servant of the Lord while rubbing shoulders with billionaires. My mother, Brenda, stood proudly beside him, her neck draped in diamonds that Preston had likely purchased to secure her unwavering loyalty. They looked so perfect, so untouchable in their bubble of wealth and religious authority. I turned down the center aisle offering champagne to the guests, while keeping my eyes averted. And then I saw her. Erica was holding court near the viewing area, wearing a floor-length crimson gown that cost more than a down payment on a house. She was surrounded by the wives of the church deacons, laughing loudly and tossing her hair over her shoulder. She looked like royalty, bathing in the glow of her white husband's financial triumph. I tried to pivot toward the opposite side of the room to avoid her, but the crowd of guests shifted, blocking my path. I was forced to walk directly past her circle. I kept my eyes glued to the rim of the champagne flutes, balancing the heavy silver tray with both hands. I almost made it past them. I was 2 steps away from the safety of the back wall when Erica turned sharply. Her eyes scanned the catering staff and locked onto my face. I saw the spark of recognition flash across her features, followed immediately by a dark, malicious joy. She did not lower her voice. She did not pull me aside. She saw an opportunity to break me down in front of the most powerful people in the city, and she took it. Erica took a sudden, deliberate step backward directly into my path. She threw her elbow out, catching the edge of my silver tray. The impact was forceful and intentional. The heavy tray tilted violently out of my hands. Half a dozen crystal flutes crashed onto the polished marble floor, shattering into hundreds of glittering pieces. Expensive champagne splashed across the bottom of my black uniform pants and pooled on the pristine white floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the ballroom, causing the surrounding conversations to come to a dead halt. Dozens of wealthy donors turned to stare at the commotion. "Oh my goodness!" Erica said, her voice pitched loud enough for the entire section to hear. She looked down at the broken glass and then looked up at me, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "I cannot believe it. Look at the family failure serving drinks at her white brother-in-law multi-million-dollar auction." The women surrounding her gasped, exchanging shocked whispers. I stood perfectly still, my hands hanging empty at my sides. The champagne soaked through my socks, making my feet cold, but I did not break eye contact with my sister. I did not cry. I did not run away like she wanted me to. "You really thought you could sneak in here and ruin Preston's big night?" Erica continued, stepping closer to me so the guests could hear every word. "You are pathetic, Gia. You appraise worthless garbage for a living, and when your life goes up in flames, you try to drag us down with you. And now look at you. You are reduced to wearing a cheap waiter uniform just to get in the same room as successful people. Clean it up, Gia. Get on your knees and clean up your mess before I have security throw you out into the street." My mother, Brenda, noticed the commotion and walked over, her eyes narrowing with disgust when she saw me standing in the spilled champagne. She did not intervene to protect me. She simply crossed her arms and nodded in agreement with Erica. Calvin watched from a distance, turning his back to maintain his conversation with the senator, completely ignoring the public humiliation of his own daughter. They were a united front of toxicity. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I slowly knelt down onto the cold marble floor, the sharp edges of the broken crystal pressing against the fabric of my pants. I began picking up the shattered pieces of glass one by one, placing them carefully back onto the dented silver tray. Erica laughed a sharp, triumphant sound and turned back to her friends, dismissing me entirely. She thought she had won. She thought she had asserted her dominance and put the rebellious scapegoat back in her place. She had no idea that I was gathering glass to build a guillotine. I stood up holding the tray of broken crystal and bowed my head slightly in a mock apology. I turned and walked back through the swinging kitchen doors, leaving the spilled champagne for the janitorial staff. The moment the doors closed behind me, I dropped the tray onto a prep counter and stripped off the catering vest. I pulled a sleek black blazer from my tote bag and slipped it on instantly, transforming my appearance from a server to an auction executive. I bypassed the busy kitchen staff and slipped out the side door into the administrative hallway of the community center. I knew the layout of this building perfectly. I walked down the carpeted corridor toward the executive offices, where the high-value private viewing rooms were located. Preston had reserved the largest suite for the lead buyer, a billionaire art collector named Marcus Thorne, who had flown in specifically to bid on the Harlem Renaissance piece. Marcus was known in the art world as a ruthless perfectionist who demanded absolute authenticity. Preston was counting on Marcus dropping $4 million tonight to save him from federal prison. I reached the heavy oak door of the VIP viewing room and tried the handle. It was unlocked. Preston was so arrogant he did not even bother to post a guard in the private suite while he was out schmoozing in the ballroom. I stepped inside the quiet room, closing the door gently behind me. The space was lavishly decorated with leather couches and a massive mahogany desk. Resting on the center of the desk was a leather-bound briefing packet prepared for Marcus Thorne, containing the auction paddle and the preliminary provenance documents Preston had fabricated. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single folded sheet of premium watermarked paper. It was a certified appraisal document bearing the official seal of the National Art Authentication Board and my own registered signature. I opened the briefing packet and placed my document directly on top of the auction paddle. It was impossible to miss. The document contained a detailed chemical breakdown and ultraviolet light analysis of the painting sitting on the stage outside. It explicitly outlined that the piece was a highly sophisticated forgery. The text explained that while the canvas itself dated back to the 1920s, the paint applied to the surface contained modern synthetic acrylic polymers that were not invented until the 1950s. It detailed the exact brushstroke anomalies and the artificial aging techniques used to crack the surface layer. The document proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the painting Preston was about to sell for millions of dollars was a complete fake. I smoothed the document flat, my heart beating with a cold, dark thrill. Preston thought he was a criminal mastermind when he broke into my apartment to steal the painting. He thought he had outsmarted the poor, struggling appraiser. But he was a wealth manager, not an art historian. He did not know the first rule of discovering a multi-million-dollar masterpiece. You never leave the real asset in an unsecured location. 3 weeks ago, when I first realized the immense value of the painting, I knew my apartment was not safe. I immediately transferred the real masterpiece to a climate-controlled biometric vault at an independent bank downtown, registering it under an anonymous limited liability company. But I needed a placeholder for my home office while I arranged the legal paperwork. I went to a local flea market and bought a dusty landscape painting from the 1920s for $200. I hired a master restorer who specialized in replicas to paint a brilliant copy of the Harlem Renaissance piece directly over the old canvas using vintage-style pigments and artificial cracking agents. The replica was visually stunning, but under a standard ultraviolet light, it would immediately show the modern acrylic layers underneath the surface. It was a beautiful, worthless decoy. I left that decoy sitting in my home office, right next to my filing cabinet. When Preston broke into my apartment in the middle of the night, poured gasoline on my floors, and stole the canvas, he did not steal a $4 million treasure. He risked a lifetime in federal prison to steal a $200 flea market painting. Now he was out there standing in front of the wealthiest investors in the city, preparing to sell that fake painting across state lines. He was about to commit felony auction fraud in front of a live audience and a billionaire buyer who would destroy him the second the truth came out. I backed away from the mahogany desk, leaving the certified appraisal document waiting like a loaded weapon for Marcus Thorne to find. I slipped out of the VIP room and walked back down the quiet hallway, the distant hum of the auction crowd echoing through the walls. Erica thought she humiliated me by making me clean up broken glass. My father thought he protected his legacy by calling me a liar. My mother thought she secured her wealth by protecting her white son-in-law. They were all about to learn that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who holds all the secrets and has absolutely nothing left to lose. I walked out the side exit of the building into the cool night air, waiting for the bidding to begin. The cool night air washed over my face as I stood in the shadows of the community center. I could hear the muffled voice of the auctioneer bleeding through the heavy brick walls. The rapid-fire rhythm of his voice told me the bidding war had already begun. I checked my watch. Marcus Thorne would not waste time. He was a man who saw what he wanted and bought it outright. I waited exactly 10 minutes before slipping back through the side door. I bypassed the catering kitchen entirely and walked straight down the main corridor toward the rear entrance of the grand ballroom. The security guards were stationed near the front stage, leaving the back doors completely unattended. I slipped inside and stood behind the final row of velvet-covered chairs. The ballroom was practically vibrating with tension and excitement. The auctioneer stood at his podium, sweating under the bright stage lights. "Do I hear 3.5 million?" He called out, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. An elegant woman in the second row raised her paddle. 3.5 million to the lady in the second row," the auctioneer shouted. "Do I hear 4? Marcus Thorne sat in the very front row looking bored. He raised his paddle without even looking up from his phone. $4 million, the auctioneer boomed, his voice trembling with adrenaline. $4 million, going once, going twice. The room fell dead silent. Sold for $4 million to Mr. Marcus Thorne. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. I watched Preston walk onto the stage, his chest puffed out with absolute arrogance. He shook the auctioneer hand and stepped up to the microphone. The spotlight hit his crisp custom suit, making him look like a savior descending from above. "Thank you all," Preston said, his voice smooth and dripping with false humility. "This is a monumental night for our community. This painting is not just an asset, it is a vital piece of Black history. It is a testament to the resilience and brilliance of the Harlem Renaissance. By securing this masterpiece tonight, we are preserving our culture for future generations." It was the most sickening display of hypocrisy I had ever witnessed. This white wealth manager was standing on my father's stage, using Black history to line his own pockets and cover up a felony. He was using the very culture he mocked behind closed doors to save himself from federal prison. I reached behind me and turned the heavy brass key on the main ballroom doors. The lock engaged with a loud, heavy click. I moved to the other set of double doors and locked them too. No one was leaving this room until the truth was dragged out into the light. I stepped out from the shadows and began walking down the center aisle. My cheap catering uniform was gone, replaced by the sharp black blazer of a professional art authenticator. There was a spare microphone resting on a stand near the edge of the stage, intended for the youth choir. I grabbed it off the stand and flicked the power switch on. The feedback whined sharply through the speakers, cutting right through the polite applause and Preston's disgusting speech. "That is a beautiful speech, Preston," I said, my voice booming through the silent ballroom. "But selling a $200 replica painted over a thrift store canvas is a bold move for a wealth manager." The entire room gasped in unison. Hundreds of heads swiveled toward me. I kept walking down the center aisle, my eyes locked dead onto Preston. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost under the harsh stage lights. His confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute sheer terror. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Who let her in here?" Preston yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He gestured frantically toward the security guard standing near the stage. "Grab her! Get her out of here right now, she is trespassing." Two burly security guards in dark suits started walking toward me, but I did not stop. I did not even flinch. I kept walking right up to the front row, stopping just a few feet away from Marcus Thorne. "She is having a psychotic breakdown," Erica screamed, jumping up from her front row seat. Her emerald gown swished around her legs as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "Do not listen to a word she says. She lost her mind when her apartment burned down. She is the family failure, and she is just jealous of my husband. Somebody call an ambulance and get this crazy woman out of my church." The wealthy donors and church deacons began muttering among themselves, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. My mother Brenda was clutching her pearl necklace, looking like she was about to faint. But I did not care about them. I looked directly at Marcus Thorne. The billionaire collector was not looking at Erica or Preston. He was staring intently at me. He recognized my face. He knew my reputation in the art world. He knew I was not a crazy woman screaming in a church. "Mr. Thorne," I said, lowering the microphone so only the front row could hear me clearly. "You demand absolute authenticity before you wire a single dime. You know my credentials. I authenticated the original piece 3 weeks ago. The painting sitting on that stage is a modern acrylic forgery. The real masterpiece is sitting in a biometric climate-controlled vault under my limited liability company. Preston stole a decoy from my apartment and tried to sell it to you tonight." Preston was sweating profusely now. Drops of moisture beaded on his forehead. "He is lying, Marcus," he stammered, wiping his brow with his expensive silk tie. "She is a disgruntled relative trying to extort us. The provenance documents are right there on your desk in the viewing room. I placed a certified appraisal in your viewing room 10 minutes ago proving it is a fake," I told Marcus, ignoring Preston entirely. Marcus Thorne slowly stood up from his chair. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and an aura of absolute authority. The entire ballroom fell dead silent, waiting to see what the billionaire would do. He did not look angry. He looked dangerously curious. He turned his gaze up to the stage and stared at the painting. "There is a very simple way to settle this," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying without the need for a microphone. He turned to his personal assistant standing nearby. "Get my authentication kit from the car." "You do not need to wait," I said. I reached into the deep pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, heavy-duty ultraviolet flashlight. I use it for field authentications. I tossed the heavy metal cylinder through the air. Marcus caught it effortlessly in one hand. "Shine that light on the canvas," I told him. Vintage oil paints from the 1920s absorb ultraviolet light and show a milky green fluorescence. Modern synthetic acrylic polymers glow like a neon sign under UV radiation. If that painting is real, it will stay dark. If it is a fake, it will light up the entire stage. "No," Preston shouted, leaping forward and spreading his arms wide to block the easel. "You cannot do this. The UV radiation could damage the delicate pigments. This is highly irregular. You cannot just inspect a $4 million piece without proper protocols." Marcus stepped up to the edge of the stage. His eyes were cold and unyielding. "Step aside, Preston," he ordered. "If I am wiring you $4 million, I am going to shine a light on my property. If you do not step aside right now, I will withdraw my bid, and I will have my legal team audit every single financial transaction you have ever handled for my associates." Preston froze. He was completely cornered. If he stopped Marcus, his entire career in wealth management would be destroyed by a billionaire wrath. If he let Marcus shine the light, his career would be destroyed by felony fraud. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe. He slowly lowered his arms and took a step back away from the canvas. Marcus climbed the 3 wooden steps onto the stage. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. You could hear a pin drop in the massive community center. Marcus stood in front of the painting and clicked the button on the back of the ultraviolet flashlight. A beam of intense purple light hit the canvas. The reaction was instantaneous and undeniable. The entire surface of the painting glowed with a harsh, bright, artificial luminescence. The modern acrylic polymers hidden beneath the fake vintage layers lit up the dark stage like a glowing billboard. The chemical signature of cheap modern paint was exposed for every single person in the room to see. The illusion of the 1920s masterpiece was completely shattered. The crowd erupted into chaos. Hundreds of wealthy church donors, investors, and politicians gasped in horror. Whispers of fraud and theft echoed through the velvet-lined walls. Women covered their mouths in shock while men aggressively whispered into their cell phones, calling their bankers to pull their investments away from Preston. The pristine reputation of the golden white son-in-law was disintegrating in real time. Preston looked like he was going to vomit. He stumbled backward, grabbing the podium for support. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his sweating forehead. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and absolute panic. He realized in that exact moment that I had played him. I had let him burn down my apartment. I had let him mock me. I had let him tow my car and offer me a pathetic bus ticket, all so I could lead him onto a public stage and watch him destroy himself. Erica was sobbing hysterically, grabbing her mother's arm and screaming that it was a setup. Brenda was shaking her head, refusing to look at the glowing fake painting, refusing to accept that her precious son-in-law was a common thief. The entire empire they had built on lies and manipulation was crashing down around them. Marcus Thorne clicked off the flashlight. He turned to Preston, his face a mask of cold fury. "You tried to sell me a $200 flea market fake," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You are finished, Preston. You will never work in finance again. I will make sure you spend the next decade locked in a federal cell." Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was suffocating under the weight of his own crimes. I stood in the center aisle watching him drown. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I had won. The family failure had just dismantled their entire dynasty without throwing a single punch. I waited for the security guards to grab him. I waited for the sirens to sound in the distance. But then something happened that I did not anticipate. My father Calvin stood up from his front row seat. He did not look angry. He did not look shocked. He looked incredibly calculated. He walked up the stairs to the stage, moving with the smooth, practiced grace of a megachurch pastor who was used to controlling thousands of people. He did not look at the glowing fake painting. He did not look at Marcus Thorne. He walked directly over to Preston and snatched the microphone right out of his trembling hands. I watched my father, expecting him to finally denounce the man who had brought ruin into our house. I expected him to save his own reputation by throwing Preston to the wolves. But Calvin was a man who worshipped wealth and proximity to power above all else. Throwing Preston under the bus meant admitting that the Pastor family was flawed. It meant admitting that they had been fooled. It meant losing the multi-million-dollar church expansion funding that Preston controlled. Calvin tapped the microphone, clearing his throat. The loud thumping sound cut through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. The donors slowly quieted down, turning their attention to their charismatic leader. Calvin offered a warm, reassuring smile, projecting absolute authority and calm. "Brothers and sisters," Calvin boomed, his voice wrapping around the room like a warm blanket. "Please let us all take a deep breath. There is no need for panic. What we are witnessing tonight is simply a tragic misunderstanding." I stared at my father, my blood running cold. "A misunderstanding." Calvin pointed a long, steady finger down at me, standing in the center aisle. "My daughter Gia has been struggling with severe mental health issues for a very long time." He lied smoothly, his voice dripping with fake pastoral sorrow. "Her apartment burned down recently, and the trauma has severely affected her grip on reality. She is deeply confused." Marcus Thorne scowled, crossing his arms. "Confused, Calvin? The painting is a documented fake. We all just saw the acrylic polymers glow under the ultraviolet light. Your son-in-law tried to defraud me. Calvin shook his head, maintaining his sickeningly patient smile. No, Marcus, he did not. Preston is innocent in all of this. The truth is, the church owns this painting. We acquired it legally through a private donation. Preston was simply acting as our broker tonight to secure funds for our new youth center. Calvin took a step closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at me with eyes as cold and dead as stone. The painting on this stage is a replica because the real masterpiece is safely locked away in a church vault. He lied without missing a single beat. My daughter Gia knew the real painting belonged to our ministry. She tried to steal it from the Lord. She replaced our authentic piece with this cheap fake and hid the real one under her own limited liability company to keep the millions for herself. Preston did not steal anything. He was trying to protect the church assets from a troubled, desperate woman. The ballroom went dead silent again. The crowd turned their eyes back to me, but this time they were not looking at me with shock. They were looking at me with disgust. My own father had just stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people and accused me of stealing from a church. He was willing to destroy his own daughter, frame me for grand larceny, and paint me as a psychotic thief, all to protect the wealthy white son-in-law who was funding his empire. Calvin had just flipped the entire trap completely upside down. He was protecting Preston. He was protecting the money, and he was going to let me burn. The silence in the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The hundreds of wealthy donors, politicians, and elite church members who had just been gasping at the glowing counterfeit painting were now staring directly at me with utter contempt. My own father had just stood on his massive stage, bathed in theatrical lighting, and branded his own flesh and blood, a thief, a liar, and a mentally unstable arsonist. He had wrapped his lies in the holy cloth of pastoral sorrow, using the very congregation that trusted him to validate a multi-million-dollar fraud. Marcus Thorne. The billionaire art collector narrowed his eyes and looked back and forth between me and my father. The heavy gold rings on Marcus' fingers gleamed under the stage lights as he crossed his arms. He was a man who demanded truth, but Calvin was a master of selling illusions. I stood frozen in the center aisle, my feet planted firmly on the plush carpet. The sheer audacity of my father's betrayal washed over me like freezing water. He was protecting Preston. He was protecting the arrogant white wealth manager who had poured gasoline on my home over his own dark-skinned daughter. He was willing to sacrifice me to federal prison just to maintain the flawless facade of his religious empire. Two large security guards dressed in immaculate dark suits began moving rapidly down the aisle toward me, their faces set in grim lines. They reached for my arms, ready to drag me out into the street and throw me to the police. "Wait!" Calvin commanded, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. His tone was sickeningly gentle, full of fake paternal mercy. "Do not harm her. She is sick. She is my daughter, and she is deeply confused by her recent trauma. Bring her to my private office. My family will handle this private tragedy with grace and prayer. We will not let the devil destroy this holy evening." The security guards nodded respectfully to their pastor. They grabbed my arms with firm, unyielding grips. I did not struggle. I did not scream or fight or try to plead my case to the crowd. Arguing with a megachurch pastor in his own sanctuary was a losing battle. The congregation had already bought his lie. They were shaking their heads, murmuring prayers for my troubled soul, while casting sympathetic glances at Preston, who was still sweating profusely on the stage. I kept my head high, my spine perfectly straight, as the guards escorted me out of the ballroom. I walked past the rows of judgmental faces, leaving the glowing fake painting behind. The administrative wing of the church was a stark contrast to the lively ballroom. It was quiet, heavily carpeted, and smelled of expensive floor wax and old leather. The guards marched me down the long corridor toward the executive pastoral suite. This was the inner sanctum where Calvin orchestrated his empire. It was a place where working-class tithes were transformed into real estate investments, luxury cars, and tailored suits. The guards opened the heavy double oak doors of the office, pushed me inside, and pulled the doors shut behind me. The heavy click of the deadbolt locking echoed in the silent room. I stood alone in the center of my father's office. It looked more like the lair of a Wall Street tycoon than the study of a humble servant. The walls were lined with dark mahogany bookshelves filled with unread theological texts and framed photographs of Calvin shaking hands with governors and celebrities. A massive custom-built desk dominated the room, facing a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling church campus. I smoothed the wrinkles from my black blazer, adjusting my cuffs as I waited. My mind was racing, calculating every possible angle. I finally understood the terrifying depth of their desperation. Preston had not just fooled my parents with his country club charm. He held something over them. Something so massive and destructive that they had no choice but to participate in his criminal cover-up. The office door suddenly swung open. Calvin and Brenda stepped inside, closing and locking the door quickly behind them. The fake pastoral sorrow and maternal concern they had projected in the ballroom completely vanished the second the lock clicked into place. The masks dropped, revealing the ruthless, calculating people they truly were. Brenda looked furious, her chest heaving under her diamond necklace. Calvin looked exhausted, the lines on his face deepening as he walked around his massive desk and collapsed into his leather executive chair. "You stupid, selfish girl," Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. She marched across the thick Persian rug until she was standing inches from my face. "What is wrong with you, Gia? How could you try to humiliate us in front of the most important donors in the state? Do you have any idea what you almost ruined tonight?" I did not step back. I met her furious gaze with absolute ice. "I almost ruined a felony fraud auction," I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "Preston burned my home to the ground to steal a masterpiece, and you are both covering for him." "Why, Mom? Why are you willing to throw me in prison to protect a man who creeps into apartments with gasoline? What does he have on you?" Calvin let out a long, bitter sigh. He rubbed his temples, his carefully manicured hands trembling slightly. "It is not about what he has on us, Gia," he said, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. "It is about what he lost." I turned my attention to my father, waiting for the truth to finally spill out. Calvin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his mahogany desk. His eyes were dark and hollow. "Preston is a wealth manager," Calvin began slowly. "When Erica married him, we thought he was a financial genius. We trusted him. I trusted him. 2 years ago, I gave Preston exclusive control over the church pension fund. It was supposed to be a secure conservative investment portfolio for the church staff and the retiring deacons. Millions of dollars of community money built up over decades of faithful tithing." Calvin swallowed hard, looking down at his desk. "Preston promised me he could double the returns in a year. He told me the traditional markets were too slow. He took $3 million of the church pension fund and he put it into highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges. He wanted to make a massive profit, take a huge commission, and make us all incredibly wealthy." The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot as the horrific truth fell perfectly into place. "He lost it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He lost the entire fund. Every single penny!" Brenda snapped, her face twisting with bitter resentment. The market crashed. The exchanges collapsed. $3 million of church money vanished into thin air. Preston has been faking the quarterly financial reports for over a year to cover the deficit. He has been printing fake statements to make it look like the pension fund is still there, but the accounts are completely empty. I stared at them, feeling a sickening mixture of horror and vindication. The perfect white son-in-law, the golden boy who was supposed to elevate our family to the highest tiers of society, was a massive failure. He was a fraud who had gambled away the life savings of working-class church members. And instead of turning him into the authorities, my parents had chosen to help him hide it. "If the deacons find out the money is gone," Calvin said, his voice trembling with a quiet, desperate panic. I am destroyed. Gia. As the head pastor, I am legally responsible for the fiduciary oversight of those funds. If the authorities discover that I allowed my son-in-law to gamble away $3 million in crypto without board approval, I will not just lose my church. I will be indicted for gross negligence and embezzlement. I will spend the rest of my life in federal prison. Preston promised me he would find a way to replace the money before the annual independent audit next month. And then he found my appraisal records. I finished the pieces of the puzzle locking together in my mind. He audited my bank accounts illegally. He saw the insurance binder for a $4.5 million Harlem Renaissance painting. He realized he could steal it, sell it at an exclusive auction, replace the $3 million he lost, keep the profit and save all of your reputations at the same time. Yes, Calvin admitted, looking up at me with desperate pleading eyes. The painting was our salvation, Gia. It was a miracle from God to save this ministry. Preston told us he took it from your apartment. He told us about the fire. We knew what he did, but we had no choice. We had to let him sell it tonight to Marcus Thorne. If he does not deliver that money tomorrow, my life is over. Your mother life is over. The legacy of this family will be entirely destroyed. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world. They had known the entire time. They knew Preston broke into my sanctuary. They knew he poured gasoline on my floors and ignited an inferno while I was sleeping in the next room. They knew I could have burned to death, and they did not care. They were willing to sacrifice my life, my home, and my sanity to protect their stolen millions and their fragile egos. The depth of their depravity was so vast it was almost suffocating. Brenda suddenly lunged forward. She grabbed me by my shoulders, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully through the fabric of my black blazer. Her eyes were wide and frantic, completely devoid of any maternal love. "You will give us the real painting right now," she demanded, her voice a desperate, vicious hiss. "You owe this family, Gia. We raised you. We fed you. You have always been difficult and ungrateful, but you will not destroy us. You know where the real canvas is hidden. You will give us the vault access codes right this second." I stared at my mother, feeling the sharp sting of her nails biting into my skin. I did not try to pull away. I just looked at her, studying the frantic terror in her eyes. "You really think I owe you?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "You watched a man try to burn me alive, and you demand that I pay his debts. If you do not give us that painting, your father will go to the police tomorrow morning," Brenda threatened, shaking me roughly. "He will tell the detectives that you are the one who stole the church pension fund. He will testify that you embezzled the $3 million to fund your failing art business and that you burned your own apartment down to destroy the financial evidence. Who do you think the police will believe, Gia? The beloved megachurch pastor with millions of followers, or the erratic daughter with no money and a history of rebellion? We will bury you so deep under the prison you will never see the light of day. Give us the painting." The sheer audacity of her threat hung heavily in the quiet office. They had truly convinced themselves that they were untouchable. They believed their power and influence gave them the right to rewrite reality and crush anyone who stood in their path. They thought I was just a scared little girl who would fold under the pressure of their intimidation. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with anymore. I slowly raised my hands and grabbed my mother's wrists. I squeezed her wrists, applying just enough pressure to make her gasp, before I firmly and deliberately brushed her hands off my shoulders. I took a step back, smoothing the lapels of my blazer. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. I felt a profound, absolute sense of peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you finally accept that the people you spent your entire life trying to please are entirely worthless. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer for the second time that night. I pulled out a thick, folded legal document printed on heavy ivory cardstock. It was bound with a dark blue ribbon and stamped with a massive embossed golden seal. I walked over to my father's desk, ignoring my mother's furious glare. I dropped the heavy document directly onto the center of the mahogany desk, right over my father's expensive leather blotter. I cannot give you the painting, I said, my voice steady and perfectly clear. Calvin stared at the document, his face turning the color of ash. What is this? He whispered, his hand hovering over the paper. I officially donated the painting to the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. This morning, I explained, watching their eyes widen in synchronized horror. I signed an irrevocable deed of gift, transferring full legal ownership to the National Archives. The painting is currently being moved from my private bank vault to an armored federal transport vehicle. It is a historical masterpiece of Black culture, and it belongs to the public, not to a group of desperate thieves. It is federal property now. Brenda let out a strangled, gasping sound, stumbling backward until she hit the leather sofa. Calvin's hands shook violently as he opened the document, his eyes scanning the official government seals and the irrevocable transfer signatures. He realized in a split second that the money was gone forever. The $4.5 million asset was completely out of reach, locked behind the impenetrable walls of the federal government. There was no way to reverse the donation. There was no way to sell the art. There was no way to save the church pension fund. You gave it away! Brenda shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. You gave away $4 million! You ruined us! You ruined everything! No, I said softly, feeling the cool satisfaction wash over my soul. Preston ruined you. I just refused to pay the bill. Before either of them could speak again, the heavy double oak doors of the office burst violently open. The wooden panels slammed hard against the walls, shattering the quiet tension of the room. Preston stumbled into the office looking like a hunted animal. His custom suit was wrinkled, his tie was pulled loose, and his face was slick with terrified sweat. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air as if he had just run a marathon. Calvin, he choked out, gripping the doorframe to keep from collapsing. The buyers are outside. Marcus Thorne called the police. There are squad cars pulling into the community center parking lot right now. They are locking down the building for auction fraud and grand larceny. Preston looked at my father, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. He did not even notice me standing by the desk. He was completely consumed by the reality of his impending destruction. We need $3 million right now, Preston screamed, his voice cracking in a desperate, pathetic plea. Calvin, you have to transfer the money from the church emergency fund. You have to cover the crypto deficit before the police audit my accounts tonight. If they look at my books right now, I am dead, Calvin. We need the money right now or I am dead. I stood in the center of the beautiful mahogany office, watching the entire empire collapse into dust. The sirens began wailing in the distance, growing louder and closer, cutting through the night air. The trap had officially snapped shut. Preston fell to his knees on the thick Persian rug, clutching his chest as the red and blue flashing lights painted the office windows. The sirens cut out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Calvin did not hesitate. The survival instinct of a man who had built an empire on lies kicked in immediately. He grabbed the phone on his desk and barked orders to his security team to stall the police at the front doors. Then he turned to me, his eyes cold and hollow. "Get out!" he hissed, pointing toward the private side exit. "You have done enough damage for one night." I did not run. I walked out of that office with my head held high, leaving them to drown in the beautiful mess they had created. I slipped through the back corridors of the community center and out into the cool night air, listening to the heavy thud of police boots rushing into the building behind me. I knew Calvin would use every ounce of his wealth and influence to post bail for Preston and keep the story out of the local papers. But I also knew that a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind, and my family was backed into a corner. I did not have to wait long for their retaliation. By Tuesday morning, the smear campaign had begun with a brutal, calculated efficiency. They could not attack me with the truth, so they decided to completely rewrite reality. It started on Sunday morning. My father took to the pulpit of his megachurch, standing before a congregation of 10,000 people and weeping genuine tears. He preached a passionate sermon about the heavy burden of loving a prodigal, deceitful daughter. He painted a tragic picture of a family trying desperately to save a lost soul who had turned her back on God and embraced a life of sin. The congregation ate it up. They wept for their poor, suffering pastor and sent thousands of dollars in special offerings to support the family during their spiritual trial. Then Erica launched the digital assault. She sat in her massive living room wearing zero makeup and a modest sweater, recording a tearful video for her hundreds of thousands of social media followers. She choked back sobs as she claimed that I was suffering from a severe drug addiction. She told her audience that my apartment fire was the result of a drug binge gone wrong and that I was now trying to extort money from her successful husband to feed my habit. She begged for prayers and privacy. The video went viral in a matter of hours. The comments section became a war zone of strangers calling me a monster, a junkie, and a disgrace to my parents. The online attacks did not stop at social media. Preston used his network of corporate cronies to systematically dismantle what little I had left of my professional life. Overnight, my independent appraisal business page was flooded with hundreds of fake one-star reviews. Anonymous accounts claimed I had stolen from them, that my appraisals were fraudulent, and that I was completely incompetent. My phone stopped ringing with client inquiries and started ringing with death threats from loyal church members. Then came the final blow to my physical stability. I had rented a small temporary office space in a modest strip mall to conduct my business while I looked for a new apartment. My landlord was an older man who attended my father's church every Sunday. On Thursday morning, I arrived at the office to find the locks changed and a handwritten eviction notice taped to the glass door. It said he could not in good conscience rent to someone who brought such shame to Pastor Calvin. My car had been towed. My home was ashes. My accounts were frozen, and now my workspace was gone. They had effectively severed every tie I had to the community, trying to starve me out and force me to surrender. I was sleeping in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, paying in cash from a small emergency fund I had kept hidden in my canvas tote bag. I did not cry. I did not panic. Their desperate attacks only proved how terrified they were. I picked up a burner phone I bought at a convenience store and made a single phone call. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a booth at a greasy diner 3 towns over, watching the rain streak the dirty glass windows. Investigator Cole slid into the booth across from me, his heavy dark jacket smelling of damp wool and stale coffee. He did not bother with pleasantries. He just looked at me with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You have been a very busy woman, Miss Washington," he said quietly. "Your family is tearing you apart in the press, and the local precinct is completely stonewalled by your father's legal team. Preston is out on bail and claiming the whole auction incident was a misunderstanding." I took a sip of my black coffee and slid my encrypted iPad across the sticky table. I tapped the screen, bringing up the 4K resolution footage from my hidden smoke detector cameras. Cole leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the crisp, clear video of Preston picking my lock, stealing the canvas, and pouring gasoline across my floorboards. I watched the seasoned investigator jaw clench as the match was struck on the screen. "This is the match I promised you," I said softly. "This is first-degree arson." Cole watched the video 3 times before pushing the tablet back toward me. He leaned back in the booth, letting out a heavy sigh. "This is good, Gia," he said, using my first name for the first time. "This puts Preston at the scene and proves he set the fire. We can lock him up for arson and breaking and entering." My chest tightened as I heard the hesitation in his voice. "But what?" I asked, gripping my coffee mug. Cole looked around the empty diner before lowering his voice. "But it is not enough to take down Calvin or expose the financial fraud at the church. If I arrest Preston for arson right now, your father will just cut him loose. Calvin will claim he had no idea his son-in-law was a criminal. He will play the victim again, and the missing $3 million from the pension fund will stay buried forever. Preston will take the fall for the fire, and your parents will walk away completely clean with their empire intact. You need something that connects the money directly to the family. You need proof of the conspiracy." I took my iPad back and slid it into my bag. Cole was right. Taking Preston down for arson would satisfy the law, but it would not give me the absolute justice I needed. My parents had watched me burn and then tried to ruin my name to protect their wealth. I needed to burn their entire sanctuary to the ground. I left the diner and drove back to my dingy motel room. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress staring at the peeling wallpaper. I needed inside their private communications. I needed to hear what they were planning when the cameras were off. My mind raced back to 3 years ago when Erica had dropped her phone in a swimming pool during one of her lavish vacations. She had been hysterical because she had not backed up her contacts. She brought the replacement phone to me, begging me to retrieve her data because I was the only one in the family who understood basic data recovery. I had fixed her phone, but I had also done something else. Years of being the family scapegoat had taught me to always keep a window open. I had quietly installed a deeply hidden background protocol on her device, a silent backdoor access point that mirrored her local network connection to a dummy server I controlled. I had never used it. I had almost forgotten it existed. I booted up my laptop and initiated the old protocol, routing my connection through a series of proxy servers to mask my location. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing lines of code to wake up the dormant back door. It took 20 agonizing minutes of waiting before the screen flickered green, indicating a successful handshake. I was in. I had full access to the secure home network of Preston and Erica million-dollar estate. I bypassed their security firewalls with ease, tapping directly into their smart home storage drives. They recorded everything for their own security, not realizing that very system was now completely exposed. I began sifting through their recent audio files, pulling recordings from the microphones integrated into their smart home hubs. I searched for timestamps matching the hours immediately following the disastrous art auction. I clicked on a file labeled Living Room Audio and put on my headphones. The crisp sound of Preston hyperventilating filled my ears, followed by the sharp clinking of a liquor glass. Erica's voice cut through the audio, sharp and frantic. "We are out of time, Preston," she hissed. "Marcus Thorne is calling the Federal Trade Commission tomorrow. My father is useless. He says we are on our own if the police search your firm." I held my breath, pressing the headphones tighter against my ears. Preston's voice sounded desperate and venomous. "Your father thinks he can just wash his hands of me." Preston spat. "He thinks he can let me take the fall for the pension fund and play the holy victim. But I am not going down alone, Erica. If that crazy sister of yours does not give us the real painting by Friday, I am executing the backup plan." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as Erica replied without a single ounce of hesitation. "Do it," she said, her voice completely devoid of any loyalty to her own father. "Transfer the remaining encrypted crypto wallets to the offshore accounts and forge the authorization signatures using dad credentials. We will plant the hardware wallets in his private church safe. If the feds come looking for the missing $3 million, they will find the breadcrumbs leading right to Calvin. We will tell the authorities he forced you to make the trades and threatened to ruin us if we spoke up. We frame him, we take the offshore money, and we leave the country." I sat in the dark motel room listening to the audio file loop back to the beginning. My parents had thrown me to the wolves to protect Preston and Erica, but Preston and Erica were already sharpening their knives to slaughter my parents. The predators were turning on each other, and I was holding the exact audio file needed to start the bloodbath. The audio file finished playing, and the silence in my cheap motel room was deafening. I sat in the dark, the blue light from my laptop screen casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. I played the recording again just to be absolutely certain. Preston's arrogant voice echoed through the tiny speakers, followed by Erica, cold calculated agreement to send their own father to federal prison. They were planning a boardroom massacre, and I was going to deliver the killing blow. I did not sleep that night. I spent the hours downloading the audio files, creating multiple encrypted backups, and sending copies to secure offshore cloud servers. I was not going to let them destroy the evidence again. I listened to my sister's voice over and over again, letting the sheer coldness of her betrayal wash over me. By the time the sun came up over the grim city skyline, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple, I had my plan perfectly laid out. I knew exactly how my father operated when he was cornered. Calvin would never let the church finances undergo a police audit while $3 million was missing. He needed to plug the hole, and he needed to do it immediately. The only way he could move that kind of money without triggering federal red flags was through an emergency discretionary loan approved by the Board of Deacons. He would spin them a story about an urgent real estate opportunity or a sudden infrastructure crisis. He would use his pastoral authority to push the vote through before anyone could ask any real questions. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday night in the executive boardroom of the main church campus. I knew the schedule because I still had access to the shared calendar from when I helped coordinate their annual charity drives. I spent the afternoon preparing myself for the final confrontation. I packed away my cheap motel clothes and pulled out the sharpest tailored suit I owned. It was a dark charcoal gray two-piece that made me look like the executive they always told me I could never be. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and sleek black heels. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot. I did not look like the prodigal daughter begging for scraps. I looked like an executioner, ready to swing the axe. I arrived at the church campus just after 7 o'clock. The sprawling parking lot was mostly empty except for the expensive luxury sedans belonging to the Board of Deacons. The main entrance was locked and guarded by 2 private security men, but I did not bother with the front doors. I walked around the back of the massive stone building to the maintenance entrance. My father had changed the digital key codes to the administrative wing, but he had completely forgotten about the physical brass key hidden in the fake rock near the HVAC units. I retrieved the key, slipped it into the heavy metal door, and turned the lock. It opened with a quiet click. I walked silently down the carpeted hallway, my heels sinking into the plush fabric. The executive boardroom was located at the far end of the corridor, featuring frosted glass walls and a massive mahogany table. I could hear the muffled sounds of my father's voice bleeding through the heavy wooden doors. He was in the middle of his pitch, his tone urgent but layered with that signature pastoral warmth he used to manipulate the masses. I did not pause. I did not hesitate. I pushed the double doors open and stepped right into the room. The boardroom was immaculate. 12 senior deacons sat around the polished mahogany table wearing expensive suits and looking extremely serious. My father stood at the head of the table, holding a laser pointer and gesturing toward a financial spreadsheet projected onto a large flat-screen television. Brenda sat to his right, clutching her designer purse, while Preston and Erica sat on the left, trying their hardest to look calm and collected. Every single head in the room swiveled toward me as the doors swung shut behind me. The sudden silence was so thick you could choke on it. Gia Calvin said, his voice dropping an entire octave. The pastoral warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, furious glare. "What are you doing here? This is a closed executive session. You are trespassing." I ignored him completely. I walked straight toward the head of the table, my eyes fixed dead ahead. The deacons shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs, exchanging confused and nervous glances. They had all heard my father's Sunday sermon. They all thought I was a drug-addicted arsonist trying to extort the church. Pastor Calvin, one of the older deacons named Mr. Henderson, said tentatively, "Should we call security?" "Yes." Calvin snapped, his face flushing dark red. "Call security right now. Get her out of this building before she causes another scene." "You do not need to call security, Mr. Henderson," I said smoothly, reaching the edge of the mahogany table. "I am not here to cause a scene. I am here to save this church from losing $3 million of pension funds." The entire table gasped. Preston shot out of his chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. His face was completely drained of color, making him look like a sickly ghost. "Shut her up," Preston yelled, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "She is lying. She is a psychotic liar. Calvin, get her out of here." Calvin marched toward me, grabbing my upper arm with a bruising grip. "You have crossed the line, Jaya." he hissed directly into my ear. "I will have you arrested and thrown in a psychiatric ward." I wrenched my arm out of his grasp with such force that he stumbled backward. I did not look at him. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen. I knew this boardroom intimately. I knew that the large flat-screen television used for presentations was connected to a high-end Bluetooth surround sound system. I opened my settings and paired my phone to the audio receiver. It connected with a soft chime that echoed through the room. "My father thinks I am lying," I said, my voice projecting clearly to every deacon at the table. "He told you I burned down my own apartment. He told you I am a drug addict. He told you I am trying to steal from the Lord. But I think you all deserve to hear the truth directly from the Golden Boy himself." I pressed play on my phone. The audio file began to play perfectly clear and amplified through the expensive ceiling speakers. The sound of Preston hyperventilating filled the boardroom, followed by the sharp clinking of a liquor glass. Preston and Erica voices bounced off the frosted glass walls, leaving nowhere to hide. "We are out of time, Preston," his own voice echoed through the room. "Marcus Thorne is calling the Federal Trade Commission tomorrow. My father is useless. He says we are on our own if the police search your firm." Then came Erica, voice cold and frantic. "Your father thinks he can just wash his hands of me." Preston spat on the recording. "He thinks he can let me take the fall for the pension fund and play the holy victim. But I am not going down alone, Erica. If that crazy sister of yours does not give us the real painting by Friday, I am executing the backup plan." I watched the color drain from Calvin's face. He stood frozen, staring at the ceiling speakers as if a ghost had just spoken to him. His carefully cultivated image of pastoral authority was melting away, leaving behind a terrified old man. Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with mounting terror as she looked back and forth between her husband and her favored daughter. The deacons sat perfectly still, their mouths hanging open in pure shock. The room felt like it was suspended in a vacuum waiting for the explosion. "When the auditors come, Preston," voice continued through the speakers, "we just forged Calvin's signature. The old man is too worried about his image to notice. We let the black pastor take the fall for the missing millions." "Do it!" Erica recorded voice commanded without a single ounce of hesitation. "Transfer the remaining encrypted crypto wallets to the offshore accounts and forge the authorization signatures using dad credentials. We will plant the hardware wallets in his private church safe. If the feds come looking for the missing $3 million, they will find the breadcrumbs leading right to Calvin. We will tell the authorities he forced you to make the trades and threatened to ruin us if we spoke up. We frame him, we take the offshore money, and we leave the country." I pressed pause on my phone. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. No one breathed. No one moved. The reality of the recording hung over the polished mahogany table like a guillotine blade ready to drop. "Mr. Henderson." The senior deacon slowly turned his head to look at Calvin. His expression was a mixture of absolute horror and profound disgust. He had trusted Calvin for 20 years. He had poured his own money into the church foundations. "Pastor Calvin," he said, his voice trembling with an underlying current of rage. "What missing $3 million? What is this about the church pension fund?" Calvin did not answer. He could not answer. He was staring directly at Preston and Erica, his eyes wide with absolute soul-crushing shock. The betrayal was so deep, so profound, that it seemed to physically break him. The man who had built his entire identity on control and manipulation had just realized he was nothing but a pawn in his own daughter game. His golden child, the perfect daughter he had favored his entire life, had been sitting in his living room, smiling at him while actively planning to send him to federal prison. And Preston, the favored white son-in-law he had protected at the cost of his other daughter, was going to frame him as the mastermind behind the embezzlement. They were going to let the black pastor take the fall for the missing millions. They were going to destroy his life, take the money, and disappear. Calvin's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just been stabbed in the heart by his own reflection. Preston was shaking uncontrollably, backing away toward the frosted glass wall. "Calvin, it is not what you think," Preston stammered, holding his hands up in a defensive gesture. "The audio is fake. She faked it. It is artificial intelligence. She is framing us." Erica was hyperventilating, clutching her designer purse to her chest, as if it could protect her from the room full of judging eyes. "Daddy, please, you have to believe us," Erica pleaded, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Gia hates me. She has always hated me. She fabricated the whole thing to destroy our family." "You are a liar!" Mr. Henderson shouted, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. The sudden noise made everyone jump. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Preston. "You gambled away our retirement funds. You stole from this congregation, and you, Pastor Calvin, you knew about it. You convened this emergency meeting to ask us for a discretionary loan to cover up a felony. You were going to use church building funds to pay back a thief." The boardroom erupted into chaos. The deacons were shouting over each other, demanding answers, threatening to call the police right then and there. The righteous anger of 12 powerful men filled the room, suffocating the pastor and his golden child. Their entire empire was crumbling into dust in a matter of seconds. Their pristine reputations were gone. Their wealth was exposed as stolen blood money. Brenda Mind could not process the reality of the situation. She could not process that her perfect son-in-law was a criminal who was planning to frame her husband. She could not process that her golden daughter was a snake who would gladly send her own father to prison to save her lifestyle. Her brain rejected the truth and instead found the only target it had ever known how to attack: me. And then Brenda snapped. The pressure of watching her perfect world disintegrate, the horrific realization that her favored daughter was a traitor, and the public humiliation unfolding in front of the deacons completely broke her mind. She let out a guttural, high-pitched scream that sounded like a wounded animal. She vaulted out of her leather chair, her eyes rolling wildly in her head. "You did this!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. She lunged across the mahogany table, knocking over crystal water pitchers and scattering financial documents everywhere. She scrambled over the polished wood, her designer dress hiking up her thighs, her manicured claws reaching frantically for my phone. "You made them desperate, Gia. You ruined everything." I took a quick step back, sliding my phone safely into my blazer pocket. Brenda slid off the edge of the table, crashing onto the carpeted floor right at my feet. She scrambled to her knees, her hair a tangled mess, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You should have died!" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls, cutting through the shouting deacons and bringing the entire room to a dead, horrifying halt. "You always ruin everything. Preston should have made sure you were in the apartment when he burned it to the ground. He should have locked your door and let you burn." The boardroom gasped in unison. The sound was like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room at once. Mr. Henderson covered his mouth, his eyes wide with disbelief. The other deacons stared at my mother in absolute paralyzed horror. Calvin dropped his laser pointer. The metal cylinder hit the floor and rolled under the table. He looked down at his wife kneeling on the floor, a look of pure terror washing over his face. Brenda had just confessed. In her blind rage and desperate attempt to defend her husband's image and blame me for the collapse of their dynasty, she had completely lost her filter. She had screamed the truth for 12 witnesses to hear. She knew about the arson. My own mother knew that Preston had poured gasoline on my home. She knew he had set my world on fire, and she wished I had been locked inside to burn to death. The deafening silence in the boardroom was the sound of a family fully and completely destroying itself. I stood over my mother, looking down at the broken, pathetic woman on the floor. The smear campaign was over. The truth was finally out, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. I looked down at my mother. She was panting, her chest heaving as she realized what she had just said out loud. The words hung in the air, a toxic cloud of maternal hatred that could never be unsaid. 12 church deacons were staring at her as if she had just transformed into a demon right in front of their eyes. "Mr. Henderson, The senior deacon actually took a step backward, knocking his chair into the glass wall. The silence in the executive boardroom was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of a dynasty shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I felt a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that comes when you realize the people who tried to bury you have just dug their own graves. For years they had called me crazy. For years they had painted me as the family failure, the unstable artist who could not fit into their perfect world of wealth and religion. They had lied to protect their own skin, and they had almost convinced the world that I was a monster. But now my mother had just confessed to covering up an attempted murder. She had screamed it at the top of her lungs in a room full of witnesses. I stepped carefully over my mother's legs as she sat frozen on the thick Persian rug. I walked to the heavy mahogany double doors of the boardroom. My heart was beating with a steady rhythmic calm. I grabbed the brass handles and pushed the doors wide open. Standing in the carpeted hallway was not the church private security team. It was Investigator Cole. He was flanked by half a dozen uniformed local police officers and 4 men wearing heavy tactical vests with FBI printed across the back in bold yellow letters. They belonged to the Federal Art Crime Team, and they did not look like they were here to negotiate. Investigator Cole stepped into the boardroom, his sharp eyes sweeping over the absolute chaos of the room. The FBI agents followed immediately, fanning out with practiced precision to block the main doors and the private side exit near my father's desk. The heavy thud of their tactical boots on the hardwood floor sounded like a death knell for my family. The deacons scrambled out of their chairs, pressing their backs against the frosted glass walls to get out of the line of fire. Calvin shrank back against the massive television screen, his face completely devoid of blood. I turned back to Preston. He was still standing near the glass wall, trembling so violently he could barely hold himself up. The arrogant sneer he had worn on the auction stage was entirely gone. He looked like a terrified child. Selling a fake painting across state lines to a billionaire buyer? I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. That is federal wire fraud, Preston. Breaking into my sanctuary, stealing an asset, and pouring gasoline on my floorboards. That is first-degree arson. And conspiring to cover up $3 million missing from a tax-exempt church pension fund. That is federal tax evasion and embezzlement. You thought you were playing a high-stakes game of chess with a poor appraiser? But you were just playing with matches. You left a digital trail a mile wide. You left your voice on your own smart home network, plotting to frame your father-in-law. And now you have federal agents standing in your church. Preston looked at the FBI agents. His eyes darted to the side exit near the mahogany desk. The primitive instinct of a cornered coward took over, completely overriding whatever tiny shred of logical thought he had left. He lunged forward, shoving his own wife out of the way, and bolted for the side door. He did not even make it 3 steps. 2 federal agents closed the distance in a blur of motion. They tackled Preston hard against the mahogany desk. The impact was brutal. Crystal water pitchers, financial spreadsheets, and leather binders went flying across the room, shattering onto the floor. Preston screamed as they slammed him face down onto the expensive Persian rug. One agent planted a heavy knee squarely between Preston's shoulder blades, pinning him to the ground. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Preston thrashed and sobbed, but the agents held him down effortlessly, reading him his Miranda rights in a cold, detached monotone. Erica watched her husband getting violently pinned to the floor and completely lost her mind. The carefully crafted image of the perfect pastor-daughter, the wealthy socialite who sneered at the working class, shattered instantly. The reality of losing her mansion, her status, and her freedom broke her psyche in half. She let out an ear-piercing shriek that sounded like shattering glass and turned her furious, wild eyes on me. "You ruined my life!" Erica screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of rage. She charged at me with her hands raised like claws, ready to tear my face apart. She honestly believed she could still bully her way out of this. She thought she could just attack me and fix the narrative like she always did. Before she could even reach me, a female police officer intercepted her. The officer grabbed Erica's arms mid-swing and twisted them sharply behind her back. Erica kicked and thrashed her expensive designer heels, slipping on the spilled water from the broken pitchers. "Let me go!" she sobbed hysterically, fighting against the officer grip. "She is the one who belongs in jail. She is a thief and a liar. You are arresting the wrong people." The police officer did not argue. She simply forced Erica face first against the frosted glass wall, pinning her there while she pulled out another pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Erica shrieked as the cold metal locked around her wrists. Her beautiful emerald gown was soaked in water, and her perfectly styled hair was clinging to her wet face. The golden child was being treated like a common criminal, and she could not process the humiliation. Calvin watched his family being physically dismantled by federal authorities right in his own inner sanctum. He looked at the FBI agents kneeling on his son-in-law. He looked at the local police shoving his daughter against the wall. And then he looked at the deacons, the 12 men who controlled his salary, his building funds, and his power, were watching him with absolute total disgust. Mr. Henderson was shaking his head, his face pale with horror. The multi-million-dollar empire Calvin had built on a foundation of hypocrisy and stolen pension funds was evaporating before his very eyes. The realization hit Calvin with physical force. The great megachurch pastor, the man who commanded thousands with his voice, suddenly could not breathe. He reached up and clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid in a series of ragged gasps. He staggered forward, his knees giving out beneath him. He collapsed onto the carpeted floor, clutching his expensive custom silk tie. He was having a massive full-blown panic attack. His chest heaved as he stared at the ceiling, unable to speak, unable to preach, unable to spin his way out of federal prison. He looked toward Mr. Henderson, silently begging for help, begging for one of his loyal followers to save him. But no one rushed to help him. The deacons just watched him fall. They turned their backs on the man who had lied to them and stolen from their congregation. Calvin was left gasping on the floor, entirely alone in a room full of people. Investigator Cole walked around the shattered glass and spilled water, stopping right in front of Brenda. My mother was still sitting on the floor where she had fallen after trying to attack me. Her hands were trembling in her lap. She looked up at the investigator, her eyes wide and pleading, still hoping her status as the pastor wife would grant her some kind of immunity. She tried to smooth her ruined designer dress, trying to maintain a shred of her former arrogance. "Brenda Washington," Cole said, his voice cold and relentlessly professional. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Brenda stared at him, her lips trembling. "I did not do anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Erica sobbing. "I am a victim here. I did not know what they were doing." "You just confessed to knowing about a first-degree arson in front of 12 witnesses and a dozen federal agents," Cole replied, his tone absolutely devoid of sympathy. "You are being placed under arrest for criminal conspiracy and acting as an accessory after the fact. Stand up and put your hands behind your back." Brenda slowly stood up, her legs shaking. She looked at the handcuffs dangling from Cole's hand, and the reality of her future finally crushed her. The country club dinners were gone, the private jets were gone, the unquestioned respect of the community was gone. She was going to be fingerprinted, photographed, and locked in a concrete cell. Erica was being dragged toward the doorway by the female police officer. She twisted her head back, looking frantically at her mother. The sheer panic in Erica's eyes stripped away whatever loyalty she had left for the woman who raised her. "Mom, tell them," Erica screamed, her voice raw and desperate, echoing down the hallway. "Tell them it was Gia. Tell them she planned the whole thing. Tell them she forced Preston to do it. Tell them to arrest her mom. Tell them." Brenda did not say a word. The investigator pulled her arms behind her back and locked the steel cuffs around her wrists. Brenda stood there, her hands bound, and looked at Erica thrashing against the police. She looked at her golden child, the daughter she had favored and protected her entire life, begging her to lie to the federal government. And then Brenda slowly turned her head and looked at me. I was standing perfectly still in my tailored charcoal suit. My hands were casually tucked into my pockets. I did not look angry or sad. I looked entirely at peace. I was the scapegoat, the failure, the daughter they had tried to burn and bury. And I was the only one walking out of that room with my freedom and my dignity intact. The realization washed over Brenda, face erasing every last trace of her former arrogance. The delusion was finally shattered. She looked at her husband gasping for air on the floor, his empire destroyed by his own greed. She looked at her favored son-in-law pinned to the ground, crying like a coward. She looked at her golden daughter screaming desperate lies, trying to sacrifice anyone she could to save herself. And finally, she looked at the heavy steel cuffs binding her own wrists. She realized in that exact moment that she had bet on the wrong people. She had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to protect a kingdom built on sand. And now the tide had come in. My mother stared at me, her eyes completely hollow, as Investigator Cole began marching her toward the door. She did not fight. She did not scream. She just walked out of the boardroom in absolute silence, knowing she had lost absolutely everything. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the story had already broken with a ferocious intensity. Every local news station and dozens of national networks were running the footage of my parents and my sister being led out of the church campus in handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their shocked, pale faces as reporters shoved microphones in their direction. The great pastor Calvin empire was completely dismantled in the span of a single chaotic news cycle. Federal investigators swarmed the megachurch, seizing computers, filing cabinets, and freezing every single financial asset connected to the ministry, while the enormous congregation reeled from the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Preston federal charges were so severe and the evidence so overwhelming that the judge flatly denied his bail. The prosecutor cited him as an extreme flight risk due to the offshore crypto accounts we had uncovered on his home server. He was sent straight to federal holding, stripped of his expensive designer suits and forced to wear a bright orange jumpsuit. Calvin and Brenda fared no better in the harsh light of day. The Board of Deacons convened an emergency public meeting, stripping my father of all his pastoral titles and completely severing his ties to the church he had built from the ground up. The state handed down heavy indictments for criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and accessory to arson. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life meticulously curating an image of untouchable Christian perfection, was now splashed across the front page of local tabloids. Her booking photo showed a woman who looked exhausted, terrified, and entirely broken. Their multi-million-dollar estate was seized by the federal government, and their personal bank accounts were frozen solid, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of very long prison sentences. I had finally moved out of the cheap motel on the outskirts of town and into a beautiful, light-filled loft overlooking the city. I was sitting at a corner table of a quiet cafe near my new building, sipping a latte and reviewing lease agreements for my new independent appraisal gallery. The morning was peaceful until a dark shadow fell across my table, blocking out the sun. I looked up and almost did not recognize the woman standing in front of me. It was Erica. But the pristine golden child, the untouchable socialite, was completely gone. The custom designer clothes and flawless makeup had been replaced by a wrinkled, oversized sweatshirt and dark, unwashed hair. Her manicured nails were chipped and bitten down to the quick. She looked frantic, her eyes darting around the cafe nervously, as if she expected federal agents to jump out from behind the counter at any second. Her personal bank accounts had been entirely seized in the embezzlement sweep, and the harsh reality of being completely broke and facing prison time had aged her 10 years in a matter of weeks. Gia, she whispered, her voice cracking as she pulled out the chair across from me and collapsed into it. Please, you have to talk to me. I have been trying to find you for days. I asked everyone in the old neighborhood. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my expression remaining completely neutral. I did not ask her to sit down. I did not ask her how she was doing. I just watched her fidget with her cheap sleeves, waiting for the inevitable pitch to begin. "I need money," Erica blurted out, leaning across the small table. Her eyes were wide and filled with raw panic. All of Preston assets are frozen by the FBI. Dad accounts are gone and the church cut them off completely. The public defenders the state assigned me are totally useless, and they are talking about 20 years in federal prison for the wire fraud conspiracy. I know you have the insurance money from the apartment fire and your new appraisal fees. I just need a loan, Gia. Just enough to retain a decent defense lawyer who can keep me out of jail. I will pay you back every single cent, I swear on my life. I stared at her, unable to comprehend the sheer delusion of her request. You are asking me to fund your defense against the federal charges I helped file against you, I said slowly, letting the absolute absurdity of her words hang in the air between us. Erica reached across the table, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled it away smoothly before she could touch my skin. Please, Gia. She begged, heavy tears welling up in her eyes and spilling over her pale cheeks. We are blood. You have to help me. We are sisters. You cannot let them lock me away in a cage. I let out a short, bitter laugh that made her flinch. Sisters, I repeated. You sat in front of a camera and told hundreds of thousands of people that I was a drug-addicted arsonist. You systematically tried to destroy my business. You sat in your lavish living room and plotted to frame our own father to protect your stolen wealth. You never treated me like a sister, Erica. You treated me like a disease you needed to eradicate. Erica's face flushed deep red, and she leaned in closer, lowering her voice into a frantic, desperate whisper, trying to weaponize our shared history. Mom only treated you badly because of how you look, Gia. It was not your fault. It was never your fault. You look exactly like Dad's first wife, the woman he actually loved before he met Mom. Every time Mom looked at you, she saw the woman who held his heart. She took her deep insecurity out on you, and I just went along with it because I wanted her to love me. I wanted to be the favorite child. But I was wrong, Gia. I was so stupid and wrong. Please, you have to understand why it happened. We are blood. She sat back, looking at me with desperate, hopeful eyes, as if revealing this decades-old family secret would somehow erase the arson, the smear campaign, and the absolute betrayal I had endured my entire life. She honestly thought throwing our mother under the bus would magically forge an unbreakable bond of sisterhood between us in her final hour of need. I looked at the woman sitting across from me without a single ounce of pity in my heart. The revelation about my mother's insecurity did not change anything. It did not heal the burns or restore the years of toxic gaslighting. It only proved how deeply broken, shallow, and pathetic they all truly were. I slowly stood up from the table, picking up my leather briefcase and my coffee. I looked down at my older sister, watching her hopeful expression slowly crumble into pure terror as she realized her words meant absolutely nothing to me. You watched your husband burn my life to the ground and you laughed. I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. You threw me to the wolves to save your own skin, and you only came looking for me because the wolves finally turned around and bit you. Blood does not mean loyalty, Erica. It just means we share the same DNA. I turned and started walking toward the door, leaving her sitting utterly alone at the table. Gia, wait! Erica cried out, scrambling out of her chair and stumbling after me. Where am I supposed to get the money? What am I supposed to do? I paused at the heavy glass door and looked back over my shoulder, giving her one final parting glance. Go ask your white savior for a loan, I said smoothly. I pushed the cafe door open and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. I walked down the busy street, listening to the faint sound of Erica sobbing loudly as she collapsed into a heap on the sidewalk behind me. I did not look back. The fire they started was finally burned out, the toxic ashes were swept away, and for the very first time in my entire life, I was completely and utterly free. The sound of Erica weeping on the concrete faded into the background noise of the city traffic as I kept walking. I did not look back at her, and I did not look back at the wreckage of my family. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, breathing in the crisp air, and feeling the heavy chains of 30 years of emotional abuse finally fall away from my shoulders. The storm had passed and the sky was completely clear. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled over the ruins of the Washington family empire. The local news stations had an absolute field day, covering the spectacular downfall of the city's most prominent religious family. The trial was a media circus, but the evidence we handed over was so ironclad that the defense barely had a leg to stand on. Preston arrogance finally caught up to him in a federal courtroom. The judge looked at him with absolute disgust before sentencing him to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. The golden boy who had always worn custom Italian suits and sneered at the working class was now locked in a concrete cell wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. There were no country clubs or offshore accounts waiting for him anymore. His life as he knew it was entirely over. My parents did not fare much better. Terrified of dying in a federal penitentiary, Calvin and Brenda took brutal plea deals. They managed to avoid prison time, but the cost was absolute and complete financial ruin. The federal government seized the megachurch, the offshore accounts, and every single luxury vehicle they owned. Their sprawling multi-million-dollar estate was auctioned off to pay restitution to the pension fund they had conspired to steal from. They were stripped of all their pastoral titles and publicly disgraced. With their savings completely wiped out and their social circle treating them like toxic pariahs, they were forced to relocate. They ended up in a tiny rundown one-bedroom apartment on the exact same neglected side of town they used to preach about saving. They had spent their entire lives mocking the poor and building an ivory tower to separate themselves from the struggles of normal people. Now they were trapped in the very neighborhood they had always despised, living out the rest of their days in quiet, humiliating poverty. While they were learning to survive in the ashes of their own greed, I was busy building a kingdom of my own. It was a warm Friday evening in downtown Atlanta. The city lights glittered outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my brand-new high-end art gallery and appraisal firm. I stood near the entrance, listening to the soft murmur of sophisticated conversation and the gentle clinking of crystal champagne flutes. The gallery was absolutely packed. These were not the hypocritical sycophants who used to grovel at my father's feet. These were real investors, museum curators, legitimate art dealers, and talented artists who respected me for my mind and my unmatched eye for authenticity. They did not see me as the broken scapegoat of a disgraced pastor. They saw me as the woman who had single-handedly exposed a massive federal art fraud ring. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored emerald green silk dress, taking a slow sip from a glass of expensive red wine. Across the room, I caught the eye of Investigator Cole. He was wearing a sharp suit instead of his usual rumpled trench coat, holding a glass of sparkling water. He gave me a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging the incredible journey we had both been on to get to this exact moment. I smiled back, raising my glass to him in silent gratitude, before turning my attention to the center of the gallery. The crowd parted naturally as I walked across the polished hardwood floor. My heels clicked softly, echoing the rhythm of a heartbeat perfectly at peace. I walked straight toward the focal point of the entire room. There, mounted on a pristine white wall and illuminated by perfectly angled gallery spotlights, was the masterpiece. It was the real Harlem Renaissance painting, the breathtaking $4.5 million canvas that Preston had tried to steal and replace with a cheap forgery. It did not belong to me, of course. It belonged to the Federal Art Museum now, but the FBI art crime team had arranged for it to be on special loan to my gallery for my grand opening night. It was their quiet way of saying thank you for my role in bringing down the embezzlement ring. I stopped just a few feet away from the masterpiece, letting the vibrant colors and raw historical power of the brushstrokes wash over me. The painting was secured behind a thick panel of protective museum-grade glass. I took another slow sip of my dark red wine and looked at my own reflection staring back at me in the clear surface of the glass. I looked at my dark eyes and my steady posture. I looked at the woman who had lost everything in a roaring apartment fire set by her own brother-in-law. I thought about the intense heat of those flames. I thought about my mother screaming that I should have burned to death inside that room. I thought about my father throwing me away to protect his reputation, and my sister begging me for money on a dirty sidewalk after trying to destroy my name. They had all conspired to strike a match and burn my entire life to the ground. They expected me to turn into ash and blow away quietly in the wind so they could keep their hands clean. But looking at my reflection, superimposed over a multi-million-dollar masterpiece surrounded by people who truly valued my worth, I knew the absolute truth. I did not just survive their fire. I had gathered up every single one of their discarded matches, and I had used them to light my own way to the absolute top. I was untouchable now. I smiled at my reflection, taking one last triumphant sip of wine as the bright lights of the gallery shined down on my new, beautiful reality. True family is never defined by shared blood, but by unwavering loyalty and mutual respect. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the exact ones holding the matches ready to burn your life down to save themselves. The hardest yet most necessary lesson is realizing that setting firm boundaries is the ultimate act of love for yourself. You clearly do not need their toxic approval to build your own empire and safely thrive. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your inner peace? Share your personal story in the comments section below.